When U.S. Marines saw the Aussie shoot-and-scoot tactics in Vietnam, many realized their own doctrine was getting them killed. While Marines were trained to fix the enemy in place and call for artillery support, Australian SAS and infantry units would hit hard for 10 to 20 seconds, then vanish into the jungle before the enemy could return fire or call in mortars. The numbers tell the brutal story. Australian forces recorded kill ratios exceeding 100 to 1 in some SAS operations, while maintaining dramatically lower casualty rates than their American counterparts. This wasn't luck or cowardice. It was a completely different philosophy of jungle warfare developed through years of fighting in Malaya and Borneo. Marine after-action reports and Australian operational analyses reveal a stark truth. Staying put after contact often meant becoming a fixed target for enemy mortars and rockets. The Australians had learned this lesson the hard way in previous conflicts. American doctrine, designed for conventional warfare, was bleeding Marines dry in the Vietnamese jungle. If you're a veteran who served in Vietnam, you lived this reality. For everyone else, this is the tactical breakdown that military historians rarely discuss: how Allied forces fought the same war with completely opposite approaches. If you value unvarnished military truth, subscribe. Check the description for full sourcing. The first time Marine Lieutenant Tom Harrison saw Australian SAS troopers in action, he thought they were retreating. It was 1968, somewhere in the dense jungle outside Nui Dat, and his platoon had just walked into what the Marines called a meeting engagement, unexpected contact with an enemy patrol. Harrison's training kicked in immediately. His men hit the deck, established a base of fire, and prepared to call in artillery support. Standard Marine doctrine demanded they fix the enemy in place and destroy them with superior firepower. But the 4 Australians attached to his patrol had different ideas. Within seconds of the first enemy muzzle flash, the SAS troopers unleashed a devastating burst of automatic fire, then immediately began moving. Not retreating, moving with purpose, flowing through the jungle like shadows while maintaining their rate of fire. Before Harrison could even get his radio operator to call for fire support, the Australians had flanked the enemy position and were pouring enfilade fire into the confused Viet Cong patrol. The entire contact lasted less than 30 seconds. When the shooting stopped, 5 enemy soldiers lay dead in the ambush zone. The Australians were already 200 meters away, moving toward their extraction point. Harrison's Marines were still in the same position where they had first taken cover, waiting for artillery that would never come fast enough to matter. This scene played out thousands of times across South Vietnam, highlighting a fundamental difference in tactical philosophy that would define how 2 Allied armies fought the same war. The United States Marine Corps, drawing on decades of amphibious warfare doctrine, believed in seizing and holding terrain while bringing massive firepower to bear on enemy positions. Australian forces, seasoned by years of jungle fighting in Malaya and Borneo, had evolved a completely different approach, one that prioritized speed, violence of action, and immediate disengagement. Marine fire support coordination manuals stressed the importance of massing fires once the enemy was located and fixed in position. Platoon leaders learned to establish a base of fire, maintain contact with the enemy, and coordinate supporting arms through forward observers and air controllers. The system worked brilliantly in open terrain where Marines could maneuver and artillery could be precisely targeted. In the triple canopy jungle of Vietnam, it often became a death trap. The Australian approach emerged from harsh lessons learned during the Malayan emergency and Indonesian confrontation. The 1st Australian Task Force conducted approximately 3,900 recorded contacts during their Vietnam deployment, the vast majority of which were short-range, short-duration engagements initiated by Australian patrols. Their tactical doctrine emphasized what they called contact and break: hit the enemy hard and fast, then disappear before superior numbers or supporting weapons could be brought into play. SAS troopers trained extensively in what they termed immediate action drills. Upon contact, the patrol would unleash maximum firepower for 10 to 20 seconds, often initiated by pre-positioned Claymore mines, then execute a rehearsed break contact procedure along predetermined routes. The entire philosophy centered on the principle that staying in one location more than a minute after firing invited mortar or heavy weapon retaliation from an enemy who knew the jungle better than any Western force ever could. The statistical evidence supporting this approach was overwhelming. Australian SAS units maintained the highest kill ratio of any Allied force in Vietnam, with some sources crediting them with over 490 confirmed enemy kills while suffering only a handful of casualties themselves. This represented a kill ratio approaching 100 to 1, numbers that seemed almost impossible until American units began witnessing Australian tactics firsthand. Marine patrol reports from joint operations frequently mentioned initial confusion and sometimes anger at what appeared to be Australian withdrawal under fire. Gunnery Sergeant Mike Torres, a veteran of 2 Vietnam tours, recalled his first impression of working with SAS troopers during Operation Toan Thang. "We thought these guys were yellow," Torres later wrote in his memoir. "They'd hit contact and immediately start moving. We were taught that you stand and fight, that you don't give ground to the enemy. It took seeing the body count after their ambushes to understand they weren't running. They were hunting." The tactical differences extended beyond simple movement techniques to fundamental questions about the nature of jungle warfare itself. Marine doctrine assumed that superior firepower, properly coordinated, could overcome any enemy advantage in terrain or local knowledge. Australian doctrine accepted that Western forces would always be at a disadvantage in extended jungle engagements, and sought to minimize exposure through brief, violent encounters that played to Allied strengths in training and equipment quality. These philosophical differences created tension even among Allied forces, who respected each other's fighting abilities. Marine after-action reports frequently noted Australian reluctance to hold positions or pursue retreating enemy forces. Australian operational summaries criticized American tendency to remain in static positions that invited enemy mortar and rocket attacks. Both approaches had merit, but they reflected entirely different concepts of how the Vietnam War should be fought. The human cost of these tactical differences became apparent in casualty statistics that military historians would analyze for decades after the war ended. Australian forces, despite operating in some of the most dangerous areas of South Vietnam, maintained casualty rates significantly lower than their American counterparts, while achieving comparable or superior tactical results. The Australian approach to jungle warfare, developed through years of fighting communist insurgents in Southeast Asia, had proven its effectiveness in the most demanding laboratory possible: combat against a determined and experienced enemy on his home ground. The weight of war in Vietnam could be measured in pounds carried on a soldier's back, and for Marines operating in the jungle, that burden often determined whether they lived or died. While Australian SAS patrols slipped through the undergrowth like ghosts, American forces struggled under loads that would have challenged pack mules. The difference wasn't just philosophical, it was mathematical, mechanical, and ultimately lethal. A typical Marine radio man in 1968 carried the PRC-25 radio system, a technological marvel that weighed 20 pounds without batteries and accessories. Add the necessary spare batteries, headset, and field antenna, and the communications package alone approached 30 pounds. The radio's whip antenna, extending 4 feet above the operator's head, created a perfect aiming point for enemy snipers while advertising the patrol's position to anyone within visual range. Marines joked grimly that carrying the radio was like walking through the jungle with a neon sign reading, "Shoot the important guy first." SAS patrols approached communications with the pragmatic acceptance that maintaining radio contact might compromise the mission more than losing it would. Their 4 to 6 man teams often operated for 7 to 10 days with minimal radio traffic, relying instead on pre-planned extraction schedules and brevity codes that could be transmitted in seconds. When SAS troopers did use radios, they treated each transmission as a potential death sentence, knowing that North Vietnamese direction-finding equipment could triangulate their position within minutes. The philosophical divide extended to individual weapon systems, where weight and reliability intersected with tactical doctrine in ways that often proved fatal. The M60 machine gun, nicknamed the Pig by Marines who carried it, weighed 23 pounds unloaded and required constant maintenance to function in the humid jungle environment. Marine doctrine centered squad tactics around the M60's sustained fire capability, but the weapon's weight and bulk made it nearly impossible to maneuver quickly through dense vegetation. Australian forces approached automatic weapons with hard-learned lessons from jungle warfare stretching back to World War II. SAS troopers often carried modified L1A1 rifles with shortened barrels and pistol grips, creating compact weapons that delivered full-power 7.62 mm ammunition while weighing barely 10 pounds. These modifications violated military regulations but saved lives in jungle encounters where the difference between clearing a vine tangle and getting caught meant the difference between escape and annihilation. The burden of indirect fire support created perhaps the most dramatic contrast between American and Australian tactical approaches. Marine doctrine demanded organic mortar support for infantry operations, requiring each company to transport 80 mm mortars with base plates weighing 30 pounds each and high explosive rounds weighing nearly 10 pounds apiece. A full mortar section represented several hundred pounds of equipment that had to be carried through terrain where visibility rarely exceeded 50 meters, and most contacts lasted less than a minute. Australian operational analysis revealed the futility of heavy indirect fire weapons in jungle patrol operations. Their statistical records showed that most engagements occurred at ranges under 100 meters, with duration measured in seconds rather than minutes. By the time mortar crews could establish firing positions and calculate firing solutions, Australian patrols had either won the engagement with small arms and Claymore mines or had broken contact and moved to new positions. The mathematics of jungle warfare simply did not support the weight penalty of crew-served weapons. Equipment loads extended beyond weapons to basic survival gear, where cultural differences reflected deeper tactical philosophies. Marine load plans emphasized standardization and redundancy, with each soldier carrying prescribed quantities of ammunition, water, rations, and medical supplies regardless of mission duration or operational environment. A typical Marine patrol carried enough equipment to sustain extended operations and fight prolonged engagements, but at the cost of mobility that proved critical in jungle encounters. SAS equipment philosophy reflected years of refinement through trial and error in jungle environments where excess weight killed as surely as enemy bullets. Australian patrol leaders customized load plans for specific missions, often carrying less water but more ammunition, fewer rations but more medical supplies, depending on operational requirements and extraction schedules. Every piece of equipment underwent rigorous evaluation. If it made noise during movement, created unnecessary bulk, or served no immediate tactical purpose, it stayed behind. The radio antenna problem illustrated how seemingly minor technical details could determine tactical outcomes. Marine patrols moving through dense jungle sounded like freight trains crashing through the vegetation, with radio antennas catching on branches and equipment rattling with every step. SAS patrols practiced moving in complete silence, with equipment secured and antennas collapsed except during actual transmission periods. The difference in noise discipline often meant the difference between detecting enemy movement and walking into prepared ambushes. Maintenance requirements further complicated the burden of heavy equipment in jungle conditions. The M60 machine gun required daily cleaning and frequent replacement of worn parts to maintain reliability in the humid environment. Mortar base plates corroded rapidly in tropical conditions, while radio batteries died quickly in high-temperature operations. Each maintenance requirement added weight in spare parts, cleaning equipment, and replacement components that patrol members had to carry through hostile territory. Australian forces developed maintenance philosophies that prioritized simplicity and reliability over theoretical performance specifications. SAS troopers often carried captured AK-47 rifles as backup weapons, knowing that Soviet-designed equipment functioned reliably with minimal maintenance in jungle conditions. The psychological advantage of carrying weapons that worked consistently outweighed doctrinal concerns about ammunition compatibility or standardization. The cumulative effect of these equipment decisions created fundamental differences in how American and Australian forces could operate in jungle terrain. Marine patrols moved slowly and deliberately, burdened by equipment loads that approached 80 pounds per man and limited their ability to maneuver quickly when contact occurred. SAS patrols moved like predators, carrying only essential equipment that supported their primary mission of finding and killing enemy forces before disappearing into the jungle. These technical differences reflected broader questions about the nature of warfare itself, whether superior firepower could compensate for reduced mobility, whether standardized equipment was worth the weight penalty in specialized environments, and whether the doctrinal emphasis on sustained combat was appropriate for a war where most engagements lasted less than 30 seconds. The answers, written in casualty statistics and after-action reports, would influence military thinking for generations after the last helicopter left Saigon. The M18A1 Claymore mine contained exactly 700 steel balls packed behind 1.5 pounds of C4 explosive, designed to create a killing zone 60 degrees wide and 50 meters deep. For American forces, the Claymore represented defensive security, a weapon to protect perimeters and channel enemy attacks into prepared kill zones. For Australian SAS patrols, it became the primary weapon of offensive operations, a precision tool that could eliminate entire enemy patrols in less than 2 seconds before the shooters vanished into the jungle. The tactical employment of Claymore mines revealed fundamental differences in how Allied forces understood jungle warfare. Marine defensive doctrine positioned Claymores facing outward from fixed positions, connected to tripwires or command detonation systems that would activate when enemy forces approached friendly lines. The weapons served as force multipliers for static defenses, extending the effective range and lethality of rifle positions while conserving ammunition during prolonged engagements. SAS employment of Claymores reflected years of refinement through offensive patrol operations, where speed and violence of action determined survival. Australian patrols positioned multiple Claymores in overlapping patterns along likely enemy routes, creating interlocking fields of fire that could devastate larger enemy formations within seconds of initiation. The mines were command detonated by patrol leaders who could observe the kill zone and time detonation for maximum effect before executing immediate break contact procedures. The mathematics of Claymore employment illustrated the deadly precision of Australian ambush techniques. A properly sighted mine could kill or wound every enemy soldier within a 50-meter arc, while additional mines positioned at predetermined intervals could catch survivors attempting to escape the initial blast zone. SAS patrol reports documented engagements where 6-man Australian teams eliminated 40 or more enemy soldiers using nothing but Claymore mines and small arms fire, achieving casualty ratios that seemed impossible until the techniques were analyzed by American tactical experts. The psychological impact of Claymore ambushes extended far beyond immediate casualties to create persistent fear among enemy forces operating in Australian patrol areas. North Vietnamese army documents captured during later operations revealed that communist commanders considered certain sectors of Phuoc Thai province virtually impassable due to what they termed the ghosts of the jungle, SAS patrols that could strike without warning and disappear without trace. The mere possibility of encountering Australian ambushes forced enemy units to move slowly and cautiously, reducing their operational effectiveness throughout entire provinces. American employment of Claymores, while tactically sound within the context of defensive operations, often reflected inadequate training and poor understanding of the weapon's capabilities. Marine positions frequently featured Claymores positioned too close to friendly lines, improperly angled to avoid fratricide, or connected to firing circuits that could be detected and defeated by experienced enemy sappers. The defensive mindset that governed American Claymore employment assumed enemy attacks would follow predictable patterns, an assumption that proved consistently wrong in jungle warfare. The patrol philosophies that governed Australian and American operations reflected entirely different concepts of how infantry should engage enemy forces in hostile territory. Australian doctrine emphasized what operational analysts termed little battles, brief, violent encounters initiated by friendly forces under conditions that maximized Allied advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy strengths. This approach required extraordinary skill in reconnaissance, camouflage, and movement techniques, but produced tactical results that far exceeded the capabilities of larger, more heavily equipped American units. American search and destroy operations reflected doctrinal assumptions developed for conventional warfare against symmetrical opponents. Large formations would helicopter into suspected enemy areas, establish fire support bases, and conduct sweeping operations designed to locate and destroy enemy forces through superior firepower and mobility. These operations achieved significant tactical successes, but at costs in casualties and resources that Australian forces avoided through selective engagement and immediate disengagement. The statistical evidence supporting Australian patrol tactics was overwhelming and undeniable. First Australian Task Force records documented approximately 3,900 separate contacts with enemy forces, with the vast majority initiated by Australian patrols operating at squad level or below. Most engagements lasted less than 5 minutes from first shot to final disengagement, with Australian forces suffering minimal casualties while inflicting disproportionate losses on enemy units caught in prepared ambushes. The enemy response to these different tactical approaches revealed the effectiveness of Australian methods in ways that official casualty figures could not capture. North Vietnamese operational directives captured throughout the war demonstrated consistent patterns of enemy adaptation to American tactics, developing countermeasures for helicopter insertions, learning to break contact quickly when confronted by superior firepower, and establishing observation posts to monitor American fire support bases and predict patrol routes. Enemy responses to Australian operations followed entirely different patterns that reflected the psychological impact of unpredictable, high-intensity engagements. Communist forces operating in Australian patrol areas adopted defensive postures that significantly reduced their operational effectiveness, moving in smaller groups, avoiding established routes, and dedicating substantial resources to counter reconnaissance efforts. The enemy clearly understood that engaging Australian patrols in sustained combat was invariably fatal, leading to tactical behaviors that surrendered initiative to Allied forces. The cost of maintaining fixed positions became apparent during major enemy attacks on fire support bases like Coral and Balmoral in 1968, where regimental-sized North Vietnamese forces concentrated overwhelming firepower against stationary targets. These engagements demonstrated that static defensive positions, regardless of how well fortified, became liability when enemy forces could mass indirect fire assets and coordinate sustained attacks. The casualties suffered during these battles validated Australian doctrine that emphasized mobility and dispersion over defensive strength and firepower concentration. The fundamental difference between Australian and American tactical approaches centered on the question of whether infantry forces should seek decisive engagement with enemy units or avoid prolonged combat through superior maneuver and situational awareness. Australian doctrine accepted that Western forces would always be outnumbered in jungle terrain and sought to minimize exposure through brief engagements that exploited Allied advantages in training, equipment, and supporting fires. American doctrine assumed that superior firepower could overcome numerical disadvantages and emphasized holding terrain while bringing maximum combat power to bear on enemy positions. The tactical lessons learned through these different approaches would influence military thinking for decades after the Vietnam War ended, raising fundamental questions about the role of infantry forces in counterinsurgency operations and the relative value of firepower versus mobility in jungle warfare. The statistical evidence supported Australian methods, but the broader strategic questions about how Western armies should fight Asian opponents remained unresolved when the last Allied forces departed South Vietnam in 1973. The fire support coordination procedures that governed American military operations in Vietnam were designed for European battlefields where enemy positions could be observed from kilometers away and artillery could be directed with precision onto clearly defined targets. In the triple canopy jungle of Southeast Asia, these same procedures became elaborate rituals that consumed precious time while soldiers died waiting for support that arrived too late to matter. The gap between doctrinal theory and jungle reality created a tactical crisis that cost American lives throughout the war. Marine combined arms doctrine assumed that infantry units would operate with reliable communications, accurate maps, and clear fields of observation that allowed forward observers to direct supporting fires onto enemy positions. The reality of jungle warfare shattered these assumptions with brutal efficiency. Dense vegetation limited visibility to arm's length in many areas, while frequent rain and humidity destroyed maps and rendered radio communications sporadic at best. Enemy contacts that developed and concluded in less than 30 seconds made coordinated fire support virtually impossible under the best conditions. The procedural requirements for calling artillery or close air support reflected peacetime training assumptions that had little relevance to jungle combat. Forward observers needed precise grid coordinates, detailed target descriptions, and clearance from multiple command levels before fires could be delivered. In jungle engagements, where enemy muzzle flashes provided the only target indication and friendly forces were often within danger, close distance of enemy positions. These procedures guaranteed that supporting fires would arrive after the tactical situation had changed completely. Australian operational analysis revealed the fundamental mismatch between conventional fire support doctrine and jungle warfare realities. First Australian Task Force contact reports showed that the average engagement lasted less than 5 minutes from initiation to conclusion, with most contacts resolved within 2 minutes through small arms fire and immediate maneuver. Artillery support, when available, typically required 15 to 20 minutes from initial request to rounds impacting the target area. Close air support response times were even longer, often exceeding 30 minutes from request to ordnance delivery. The equipment issued to American forces reflected institutional assumptions about warfare that jungle combat rendered obsolete within weeks of deployment. Standard web gear designed for temperate climates created noise and discomfort in tropical conditions, while providing inadequate capacity for the additional water, ammunition, and medical supplies required for extended jungle operations. Leather boots rotted within days in the humid environment, while steel helmets created distinctive silhouettes that enemy snipers could identify at extended ranges. Australian forces approached equipment selection with pragmatic acceptance that standard military gear was often inadequate for jungle conditions. SAS patrols routinely modified or discarded issued equipment that compromised operational effectiveness, substituting bush hats for helmets during patrol operations and developing load-carrying systems that eliminated noise while providing quick access to essential items. These modifications violated military regulations but reflected years of experience in jungle environments where survival depended on adapting to conditions rather than following prescribed procedures. The Jungle Training Centre at Canungra, Queensland, had developed training programs that emphasized environmental adaptation and tactical flexibility based on combat experience from World War II through the Malayan Emergency. Australian instructors taught American personnel techniques for silent movement, equipment modification, and small unit tactics that contradicted much of their previous training but proved essential for jungle survival. Many American units that completed Canungra training reported significant improvements in patrol effectiveness and reduction in casualties during subsequent operations. The institutional resistance to modifying equipment and procedures reflected broader problems with military bureaucracy that prioritized standardization over battlefield effectiveness. Supply systems designed to equip conventional forces proved inadequate for specialized jungle operations, while regulatory requirements often prevented unit-level modifications that could improve tactical performance. Australian forces operated under more flexible policies that allowed commanders to modify equipment and procedures based on operational experience rather than regulatory compliance. The linear battle mindset that dominated American military thinking assumed that enemy forces would occupy identifiable positions and engage in sustained combat that allowed superior firepower and technology to determine tactical outcomes. Vietnamese Communist forces, drawing on decades of experience in guerrilla warfare, consistently avoided these conditions by initiating brief engagements under favorable circumstances and breaking contact before Allied forces could bring superior resources to bear. This tactical approach negated many American advantages while exploiting weaknesses in equipment and doctrine designed for conventional warfare. Australian forces had confronted similar challenges during counterinsurgency operations in Malaya and Borneo, developing tactical approaches that accepted the limitations of Western military advantages in jungle environments. Their doctrine emphasized small unit operations that could operate independently for extended periods while avoiding decisive engagement except under conditions that favored Allied forces. This approach required soldiers with exceptional individual skills and unit cohesion, but produced tactical results that validated the investment in specialized training and equipment. The psychological impact of equipment failures in combat situations extended beyond immediate tactical consequences to undermine confidence in military leadership and institutional competence. Marines who experienced weapon malfunctions during firefights, radio failures during critical operations, or equipment breakdowns during extended patrols developed skepticism about official assurances and standard procedures that affected their performance in subsequent operations. Australian forces, operating with equipment selected and modified based on combat experience, maintained higher levels of confidence in their equipment and procedures. The fundamental problem with American equipment and doctrine in Vietnam centered on the assumption that technological superiority could compensate for tactical and environmental disadvantages. This assumption led to over-reliance on complex systems that frequently failed in jungle conditions while underestimating the importance of individual soldier skills and small unit tactics that proved decisive in most combat situations. Australian forces approached jungle warfare with realistic assessment of technological limitations and emphasis on human factors that proved more reliable in combat conditions. The lessons learned about equipment inadequacy and doctrinal obsolescence would influence military development for decades after the Vietnam War, leading to major changes in individual equipment, small unit tactics, and training procedures. However, the institutional tendency to rely on technological solutions rather than human adaptation continued to create problems in subsequent conflicts where environmental conditions and enemy tactics challenged conventional military assumptions. The gap between institutional doctrine and battlefield reality remained a persistent problem that affected military effectiveness long after the helicopters departed Saigon. The human brain requires approximately 2 seconds to process unexpected sensory input and initiate conscious response to life-threatening situations. In jungle combat, those 2 seconds determined whether soldiers lived or died, and the difference between trained reflexes and conscious decision-making often meant the difference between going home or being carried out in a body bag. The psychological impact of sudden, violent contact in dense vegetation created mental and physical responses that no amount of stateside training could fully prepare soldiers to handle. Marine training emphasized fire discipline and coordinated response to enemy contact, with soldiers taught to seek cover, identify targets, and maintain unit cohesion while calling for supporting fires. These procedures worked effectively in open terrain where threats could be observed and coordinated responses developed over time. In jungle environments where enemy contact occurred at ranges measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, the time required for conscious decision-making exceeded the duration of most firefights. SAS training at Canungra and in operational areas hammered immediate action drills into muscle memory through repetitive exercises designed to bypass conscious thought during the critical first seconds of contact. Australian soldiers trained to respond with maximum violence immediately upon enemy contact, emptying magazines and detonating pre-positioned explosives within seconds of the first shot while simultaneously moving toward predetermined rally points. The training was brutally realistic, with live ammunition and explosive charges used to simulate combat stress that could not be replicated through blank fire exercises. The neurological reality of combat stress created physical responses that often contradicted tactical training and logical thought processes. Heart rates increased to levels that impaired fine motor control, while adrenaline dumps created tunnel vision and auditory exclusion that made coordinated unit actions extremely difficult. Soldiers experienced time dilation effects where seconds seemed like minutes, making it impossible to gauge the actual duration of firefights or coordinate timed movements with other unit members. Marine combat veterans described the paralysis that often accompanied the first moments of unexpected contact when training and instinct conflicted with the overwhelming sensory assault of automatic weapons fire in enclosed jungle spaces. The psychological impact was compounded by doctrinal requirements to maintain positions and coordinate responses, creating mental conflicts between survival instincts that demanded immediate movement and military discipline that required remaining in position under fire. SAS veterans recalled similar initial shock and fear during first combat experiences, but credited immediate action drills with providing behavioral scripts that functioned when conscious thought failed. The training had conditioned automatic responses that initiated within milliseconds of contact, allowing soldiers to begin effective action while their conscious minds were still processing the threat. This training approach accepted that soldiers would experience fear and confusion during combat while providing behavioral frameworks that functioned despite psychological stress. The institutional culture surrounding contact procedures reflected fundamentally different philosophies about soldier psychology and combat effectiveness. Marine doctrine emphasized unit cohesion and coordinated response, assuming that disciplined soldiers could maintain tactical effectiveness through training and leadership even under extreme stress. This approach worked well when units had time to develop coordinated responses, but often failed during brief jungle encounters where individual initiative determined survival. Australian doctrine accepted that soldiers would experience extreme stress during combat and designed procedures that functioned despite rather than in opposition to natural human responses to life-threatening situations. Individual initiative was encouraged and expected, with unit coordination occurring through pre-planned procedures rather than complex communication during combat. This approach recognized that effective jungle fighters required exceptional individual skills that could not be replaced by institutional procedures. The fear of encirclement dominated American tactical thinking in ways that often prevented effective response to enemy contact. Marines were taught that breaking contact without orders could lead to unit fragmentation and subsequent defeat in detail by enemy forces. This institutional paranoia created hesitation during critical moments when immediate movement could have saved lives, as soldiers weighed survival instincts against military discipline and fear of courts-martial for unauthorized withdrawal. Australian forces operated under tactical doctrine that treated immediate disengagement as a success rather than a failure when conducted under appropriate circumstances. Patrol leaders were trained to assess tactical situations rapidly and authorized to break contact whenever continued engagement favored enemy forces. This approach required exceptional judgment and tactical skill, but eliminated the psychological conflict between survival instincts and military discipline that paralyzed many American units during critical moments. The psychological impact of casualties on unit cohesion created cascading effects that extended far beyond immediate tactical situations. American units that suffered heavy casualties during static defensive actions often developed institutional trauma that affected performance in subsequent operations, with survivors becoming risk-averse and hesitant to engage enemy forces under similar circumstances. The psychological association between defensive positions and casualties created reluctance to establish defensive positions that were tactically necessary for mission accomplishment. SAS units that lost personnel during offensive operations typically maintained aggressive tactical postures and continued high-risk missions with minimal psychological impact on unit effectiveness. The difference reflected cultural expectations about casualties and tactical doctrine that emphasized individual responsibility and unit mission accomplishment over personal survival. Australian soldiers understood that aggressive tactics produced lower overall casualty rates despite higher individual risk during specific operations. The long-term psychological consequences of different tactical approaches became apparent in post-war studies of combat veterans and their adaptation to civilian life. American veterans who served in units that suffered heavy casualties during static operations reported higher rates of survivor guilt and psychological trauma related to helplessness during combat situations. Australian veterans reported different patterns of combat-related psychological stress that focused on individual decisions and actions rather than institutional failures and systematic exposure to enemy fire. The fundamental psychological difference between American and Australian approaches to jungle combat centered on locus of control and individual agency during life-threatening situations. American doctrine emphasized institutional solutions and coordinated responses that often left individual soldiers feeling powerless during combat situations where survival depended on personal action rather than unit coordination. Australian doctrine emphasized individual competence and decision-making authority that gave soldiers psychological ownership of their tactical situation and survival. The casualty statistics that emerged from different tactical approaches reflected not only immediate battlefield effectiveness, but also the psychological sustainability of different combat methods over extended periods. Units that maintained aggressive, mobile tactics suffered lower casualty rates and maintained higher morale than units that relied on static positions and defensive firepower. The psychological advantages of tactical approaches that gave soldiers control over their survival proved as important as the immediate tactical benefits in determining long-term unit effectiveness and individual soldier welfare.